2, 1,
0.
And we are live. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes for people to join. And boy, that was quite an uphill battle with technology on both our sides, really. Welcome, everybody, to Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live. I'm your host, Brendan Baylod. This is our semi-weekly show on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, and we are really privileged tonight to have one of my mentors and a longtime friend and colleague, Pat Labadie. So, Pat, welcome to Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live.
Oh, bless you! What a privilege. Thank you. Thank you.
And we had a bit of an exciting few minutes here. Just in that the BeLive platform wasn't working right, Pat's Facebook wasn't working right. We had a bunch of drama, but better late than never. We were about 20 minutes late, and that's all right because this isn't a TV show. So, folks, if you're watching, feel free to share your comments on the right. Let us know you're there, so we can see that you're joining us. And I'd like to thank all our viewers for joining us tonight. Little bit of housekeeping. We have, I don't think we have a show scheduled for next week. So for those of you who have been watching it every week that I have somebody, I think we're going to take a week off. I do have some other guests that are lined up, though, in the pipe, but I'm not ready to announce any of them yet. A few other things. I want to remind everybody, I posted a GoFundMe that has been shared pretty widely around the internet for Tom Farnquist. Tom is in need of a lung transplant, and they have posted a GoFundMe site for him. They want to raise about $20,000. They're up to about $6,000. So if you have the means, please do donate. Any little bit helps. Tom has been fighting, I think, a chronic lung condition for many years, and it's recently gone downhill. He's been approved, apparently, for the lung transplant. So anything you can do helps. And for those of you who don't know, of course, Tom is the founder of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, and a member of this group. So best wishes and best luck to Tom. I hope things work out. I also want to remind everybody that we are going to have a Zoom room at the end of this. We will start the Zoom room probably after about a 15-minute break. We're going to run until about 8:20, and we will probably do the Zoom room starting at 8:30. That would be 9:30 for you Michiganders. Feel free to join us if you have questions for Pat. Please join us in the Zoom room and ask them there. That's about all the housekeeping I have. And I see we've got plenty of people joining now. So why don't we get started? So for many of you, some of you may not know Pat. Pat is, really one of the premier maritime historians on the Great Lakes, and has been around for quite some time doing that. I first encountered Pat obviously through the books that he has participated in, but I first met him through my friend Randy Beebe from Duluth. And Randy and I had been working together, and one of the first things Pat and I ever did together was when I was up at Eagle River, Michigan, and I noticed a large blob out in the water off of Garden City Creek there, just east of Eagle River. And I went out there, and it was a huge keel and ribs on the bottom, and in the back of it was a giant metal gear. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? Well, it turned out to be the wreck of the steamer Peninsula. And Pat came all the way from Duluth, and so did Randy, and we went out there and took a look at it, and within a week it was buried completely. So quite an experience. But anyway, Pat, one of the things that I always ask all our guests sort of to start out is how did they get started, and how did they get interested in maritime history? Because it really is sort of an odd avocation, not something that most people get involved in. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started.
Well, interestingly, when I was a kid, before I even began school, This image shows me at my parents' cottage in Canada with a fish tug on the beach. And so I was exposed to not only Grandpa's stories, but, to some relics as well, including all of my grandfather's and his dad's shipbuilding tools, which I still have. Yeah, that was an interesting introduction to this part of our history. Yeah, when I began school, my grandfather had passed away, but I developed an interest in learning more about that world that he described. And in particular, of course, I was inspired by all the tools that he left behind. And I thought I wanted to be a naval architect or maybe go to the Naval Academy or something. And so I explored a lot of different options. And when I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Detroit, where one of my engineering professors was Father Edward Dowling, a well-known historian in the Detroit area. And I spent 2 years with him. He shared a lot of resources with me in the years that followed. I would go to his place at the university, and he'd loan me 100 photographic negatives of ships every week, and I'd take them home and print them in my darkroom. But he was on the board at the Dawson Museum in Detroit and got me my first position as staffer at Dawson Museum. And I dropped out of college and never went back. Instead of pursuing naval architecture degree, and the other person whose portrait you see there is Howard Chappell from Smithsonian. And he wrote a number of very inspiring books about naval architecture and the development of ships. But I corresponded with Chappell and, of course, worked with Father Dowling in those years. And they kind of convinced me to abandon the idea of getting into shipbuilding. Chappell told me if I became a naval architect, I would probably be designing plastic fish boats for the rest of my life. And that wasn't exactly what I had in mind. So I did indeed abandon my college degree after only 2 years and went to work at the Dawson Museum, developing exhibits and doing research there. And that was my beginning years. Yeah, I started at Dawson in 1960, and was there for the next 8 years, serving in various capacities, designing and developing exhibits, doing some preliminary research, taking care of collections. And it was a wonderful time. I met a lot of historians there. Father Dowling was still involved at Dawson Museum, but Bill Hoey, Bill Warden, local historians, not a whole lot older than I was, introduced me to all kinds of different resources and people in the community. And so those were years of real growth and enormous discoveries for me. I was really very pleased to work at Dawson for the next 8 years. I began building ship models there, and as I say, worked on developing exhibits of various sorts. And that exposed me to much more than just naval architecture or ship design, but the evolution of ships on the lakes. And I became absolutely obsessed with the subject of the evolution of wooden ships in particular, and just stuck with that for the next decades.
Pat, is my audio working? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay. What was it like? What was Dowling like? Many of us, wished we had met him. What kind of guy was he, and how did he come up with those thousands and thousands of pictures that he had in his collection?
He collected them for years uh, dealing with a lot of other collectors and historians, and he was very generous in sharing them with me and with others. And uh, he, you know, used a lot of them for printing books and stories. And he was a regular contributor to Inland Seas and to Telescope magazine at Dawson Museum. And so I really benefited, from him, and developed literally thousands of photographs from his negatives over the years. And in the end, I developed a pretty darn sizable collection, almost exclusively 19th century Great Lakes ships. But boy, what a resource it was. But he was a very modest person involved in a lot of different historical groups and agencies. And I just loved working with him. I also went up with him to the Sioux, where he served a local parish during the summer months when he wasn't teaching. And he introduced me to a lot of people in the port at Sault Ste. Marie, either ferry owners or vessel operators or museum personnel at the Corps of Engineers Museum there. So he was very helpful in introducing me to a lot of others.
As you've done since with many other people as well, and kind of carrying on in his footsteps, I guess, what one might say. So after you left Dawson, Pat, you went to Saugatuck. That's something I didn't know. I actually wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, that was a very exciting period of time. In 1968, I left Dawson Museum and moved to Saugatuck. That was after the riots in Detroit, and decided to take my family to the other side of the state. When I learned about the opening at the Keewatin Saugatuck Museum, I was successful in getting that position with Father Dowling's support, and managed the Keewatin for the next 8 years, or from 68 to 73. And she was newly acquired by Roland Peterson of Saugatuck. And we went through a lot of changes and improvements to the vessel because it had been retired, from the Canadian Pacific Railway steamship line. It was built in Scotland in 1907. And when Peterson acquired it, it required some, modernization to make it a tourist attraction. And it was really a pleasure to work on board in that capacity. And then when we did get it ready and open to the public, it succeeded in attracting a lot of people to Saugatuck. And I just love the time that I spent on board that vessel. It was gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. And it was interesting too. There was a lot of its history that was still very visible. When she was brought into the Great Lakes after construction in Scotland, she had to be cut in half to get through the canals. She was oversized for the Welland Canal. And you could still see the place in the center of the hull where she had been riveted back together after that.
Wow.
Journey. Yeah. It wasn't, all that obvious, but with some care, you could see the fresh rivets there. And the vessel hadn't been changed a whole lot since it was built, and it's beautiful. And it is still preserved over in Georgian Bay. Roland Peterson sold it a few years ago, and it was brought back to where it was originally based in Georgian Bay, first at Owen Sound, and more recently, I'm not sure where it's based, but it's quite an attractive tourist attraction there now.
Did its engines still work when you were taking care of her?
They weren't operated, but they were still, functionable. They were well cared for. One of the things that Mr. Peterson did, however, was to remove the boilers. He had them all cut up and removed. in order to lessen the draft, the depth of water where the ship could be berthed. And that was kind of unfortunate. But nevertheless, the engine room is still undisturbed and intact. The boiler room, however, is pretty open.
So Pat, one of the way I always knew of you, I actually wasn't aware of your work in Saugatuck, and I only learned of your work at Dawson when I saw a picture of you in the old telescopes back in the early '60s, and I was like, oh my God, that guy's been around forever. But I got to know you back in the days at when you were in Duluth at
Yes.
in Al Park. How did that come about? And tell us a little bit about your time there.
Well, I went through a divorce when I was living in Saugatuck, and decided to, look for another place to live, and learned about the new Marine Museum built by the Corps of Engineers in Duluth. And so I applied for directorship and succeeded in getting that job. And it was wonderful. Duluth, of course, is a very active port, and it's a gorgeous setting. The museum building is right alongside the ship canal. And in one of the images here, you can see the towers for the bridge right next to the building. And so people gathered in the building and outside on the sidewalks there to watch the ships entering or leaving the port. And it was a wonderful, wonderful time. We also had an average of 450 or up to 520,000 visitors a year. And
wow.
It was very, very successful, particularly when I came in 73. No, I came in 68 and was there till 73. No, I'm sorry, I'm confused now. I was there in 73 till 2000. And 2 years after my arrival was the passing of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it increased the visitation tremendously at Dawson, at the Lake Superior. Yeah, but we developed a lot of exhibits to illustrate the cargoes that were being transported, and you can get the next slide there. You'll see we dealt with the port, and we had a number of participants on the board who were in the Port Authority. At that time, U.S. Steel's Great Lakes Fleet was headquartered in Duluth. So we had a lot of industry people on the board, and what a wonderful partnership that became as a result. They shared all kinds of resources with us. We had a schedule of vessel arrivals and departures posted in the building all the time, so people knew, how long they might have to wait to see the next ship. And I can't help thinking, one of the traditions that we saw demonstrated at the museum was the girls who used to hang out waiting for the ships, and they would sit there. Oh my goodness, here comes my fiance, and 2 hours later, oh, there's my other fiance. So there was quite a culture there in these major ports of women who were associated with the maritime industry. But it was the first time I had ever been so actively involved with industry people and with port personnel of various sorts. And the board of directors officers are shown in this illustration here. And of course, it also shows the proximity of the museum on the left to the bridge and to the passing vessels. It was a magic place. Next, please.
Well, before we move on, Pat, one of the things that I can't help but notice is that picture in the lower right is the book signing, probably the launch of Dr. Wolf's Lake Superior Shipwrecks, because I see the book table. And
that's right.
Dr. Wolf on the right and Tom Holden, who's probably watching tonight, on the left. That is just
my goodness
book. What was Dr. Wolf like? I met him. He's just in his final year. I got him to sign my book, but
Yeah.
he's considered a real legendary figure. Tell us a little
Oh,
bit about him, if you would.
absolutely. Well, the interesting thing was that when I moved to Duluth, I bought a home on Vermilion Road. Dr. Wolf lived right across the street from me. And
Wow.
so I know him, of course, from the board at the museum, where he was very actively supportive. But we were also neighbors, and we shared a lot of time together. And what a gift that was. He was a wonderful researcher, very well informed, and well known all around Lake Superior. And yeah, I remember very well his authoring that book, and what a privilege it was to offer it at the museum for our visitors. But yeah, he was one of several, really notable people on the board there. The next image that you're seeing here shows some of the exhibits. We tried to illustrate the cargoes that were carried on the vessels, and we described the statistics, for the tonnage that was moved in and out each year. We also explored the evolution of Great Lakes watercraft with models and plans. And then in the lower black and white image there, you see relics of various vessels, most of which had been, retired or scrapped. And we were fortunate enough, because of the industry people on our board, to acquire a lot of wonderful artifacts from some of those ships, many of which were very well known. So we built an amazing collection of artifacts there over the years. And one of my jobs, of course, was to manage the collection, catalogs, and records.
So the
Yeah,
big thing, obviously, that happened there, Pat, in 1975 that spiked the tourism,
it sure did.
the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yeah. She left the port. Actually, she went out the Superior Entry, which is a couple of miles from the museum down the shore. But we could watch the ships coming and going, and we saw the ship leave. And a day later, she ran into that awful storm on the north shore of Lake Superior. And I was able to get a lot of data, but particularly after the Navy personnel had filmed the wreck, I had information enough to do a pretty accurate model of exactly what it looked like. And I think the appearance of the model explains a lot about the sequence of her sinking. She clearly broke in half on the surface, and it appears that the bow portion struck bottom very quickly, but the stern stayed afloat for a short while, and it rolled over and emptied its whole load of iron ore on top of the sunken bow. So you can see here all the ore on the bottom of the lake, and then the stern portion settled to the bottom, not far from the bow. But it's really interesting and drew a great deal of interest from our visitors there for the next years.
And I believe that's still there. I wasn't aware that that was your model. It's an amazing model and does a great job of explaining it.
It really was, very revealing.
I'll say. And then, of course, the visitors kept coming, right?
Absolutely. The next year or two, the visitation increased, and it's been very stable for the years since. And it wasn't unusual to have 510, 520,000 a year. Very enviable for a museum. And of course, it was a real treat for us. We had all kinds of programming to offer for the visitors. And it was just after this, I think, that the Corps retired a small tugboat and put it on display outside in front of the museum building. So the building was enlarged a bit, and we acquired a steam engine and some really large artifacts from retired vessels that could be displayed there in the enlarged facility.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is quite a interesting picture of you from what, 1970?
76, I think.
Wow. Yeah, and I imagine Gales of November helped quite a bit too. That's always been a landmark thing that draws a lot of people up there. But I think one of the things that and I have been involved in quite a lot, and an organization that's really important to me is the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History. You and I have both served on the board, and boy, what a great way to meet other historians and to get to know the community.
That I was the first president when it was formed in 1982, and interestingly, we had a visitor, Dr. Cornelius Osgood, from the Peabody Museum at Yale, and he was visiting Great Lakes museums and called at our place, and my wife and I took them home, and we had dinner together. But he had very strong feelings about building some sort of an organization to unite museums and historical maritime history agencies around the Great Lakes, because there really didn't exist such an organization. There were several competing groups with different museums, but nothing that bound them all together as the association would. So he met with a couple of historians before he and his wife left the Great Lakes on their visit, and he wrote a wonderful article for the newsletter at Manitowoc Museum, which was circulated widely, and it encouraged us to form the association. And Henry Barkhausen and Edmund Fitzgerald's daughter, Elizabeth Cutler, funded a lot of the beginning meetings and things. And we all came together, several times, developed bylaws, and formed the organization in 1982. And I was fortunate enough to be invited as its first president, and what an experience it was. We met annually. We produced a newsletter. Bob O'Donnell published it for many years, and it was very, very informative. And the first publication of its sort, really, that dealt, with events at all the different museums, but also brought us all together to develop, some really important decisions about policy making. And I just so love that organization, and a number of people have served in recent years in the board and as presidents, and just done an incredible job of bringing us all together. It's been a real asset for all of us in the museum business.
And I have to add to that, a couple of people are asking how to join, aglmh.net, and I would encourage anybody who's listening tonight to become a member. Their newsletter is amazing. Their annual conference is held at a different museum across the Great Lakes every fall. Hope, God willing, it'll be held again this September. We missed it last September. I think it's going to be at Buffalo and Erie, Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And boy, what an opportunity. I met through the AGLMH. I met so many people. I met Henry Barkhausen. I met the author James Barrie. Henry Barkhausen and James Barrie were about the same age, and I got to see them both and got all my books signed. Just an amazing opportunity, and a lot of those people are not with us anymore.
Exactly.
I acquired much of my collection through my, Bill McNeil. We lost him a few years ago. He and I used to correspond and trade material. So please, if you're a budding maritime historian, consider joining the AGLMH. So then, Pat, you got active with documenting shipwrecks, and it sounds like that wasn't something you had been doing prior. How did you start doing that?
Well, it was interesting. When I was director at the museum in Duluth, a number of Park Service personnel approached me for information for research on some of the vessels. And Julius Wolf, Dr. Wolf, was a participant too in furnishing information for the Park Service divers and historians. And before long, I was invited to participate in the diving and the research at the island. And so I spent quite a few years, for the first time, as you observed, measuring and defining some of the wooden shipwrecks in particular. And it was very, very revealing to me and very informative. And the National Park Service invited me later to go to not just Isle Royale, but Pictured Rocks and Apostle Islands and a number of other sites, particularly on Lake Superior. And so we worked together for a lot of years, and I'm still in contact with their personnel, several of whom, of course, are retired now, but they've been very, very helpful. A couple of years ago, the National Oceanic and Administration proposed to start a new sanctuary on Lake Ontario, and Jim Kennard, who had found the HMS Ontario, 17 something, I don't remember the date, but he was very concerned about public access, to this historic wreck if NOAA succeeded in establishing a sanctuary there. And so I was able to contact some of my Park Service friends who had long experience dealing with naval vessels from other countries in American waters, where they had to get permission from the other countries, to allow access or to provide some sort of protection for those wrecks. And so these Park Service personnel, now retired, Larry Murphy and I can't even think of their names. Anyway, they provided access to foreign governments so that the British government, for instance, could help develop some sort of a plan for protecting the Ontario. And Jim Kennard is much relieved, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So the sanctuary movement in Lake Ontario is going ahead, but for the time being, the Ontario, the warship, is not a part of it, and they're developing a plan so that it'll be introduced later to the Marine Sanctuary. Anyway, personnel have been wonderful consultants.
And so, Pat, I see the Submerged Cultural Resources study there that you were an active participant in drafting. I know Ken Vrana, our guest a few weeks ago, was involved in that too. I was able to collect all of those Submerged Cultural Resources studies. My favorite is and one of the rarest is the Pictured Rocks one that you were the principal investigator on.
Yeah, that was a real thrill working on that. And I've since done, similar works together with Park Service personnel at Isle Royale and then at Whitefish more recently too. So it was a wonderful experience.
So, and I may be going up there with Ken Vrana. We may be doing a little project together to see if we can find the Dagmar. We'll see what comes of it.
Oh, my goodness.
One of the things that has always interested me the most is, the Milcoquins shipwreck. And a lot of our viewers may not know about this.
Oh, yeah.
You and I worked on trying to identify this, and it's still unidentified. It's one of the Great Lakes' most enduring mysteries.
Yes, it is. We found a lot of hints, but no real resolution. For a lot of years, I thought it was commanded by a guy named David Corp, C-O-R-P. He was a survivor of the wreck, and he married a local Indian woman and had a couple of children with her there before he left and went back to Clayton, New York, where he had come from.
Let's back up a little bit and tell folks a little bit about what this is and how this came to be, because I don't think our viewers, many of them, know what this is. Tell the story a little bit about how this was found and.
Well, it was discovered by a young boy um, in the mouth of the Millicokins River at Epafet, Michigan, and he found it because a tiny portion of the figurehead and the bow were sticking out of the riverbank. And so he brought people there. And at first they didn't think it was anything, but it was soon obvious that the whole wreck was buried in the sand. And so, oh, good grief. Halsey,
He was the Michigan kid.
officer.
Yeah.
Yeah, he and I went up there to investigate it, and we had a local bulldozer come and help us to excavate a portion of it just to see, how far back it extended from the riverbank and how wide it was. And we didn't disturb it, but it did offer some hints as to what we were looking at. And in the next couple of years, East Carolina University sent a whole team of archaeologists to excavate it, as you see here, very cautiously, very professionally. And they found a lot of artifacts. One of the key things was a coin dated 1833 under one of the masts. A portion of the mast was still there. And when they removed it just a couple of feet tall, here was this coin. And it's a long-standing tradition in those days that a coin with the date of a ship's launching was preserved under the mast, as we found it here. So we are pretty confident that it dates to 1833, but the only reference we had seen to it was a survey in 1847, I think, where a local surveyor described the shipwreck, and there was no name attributed to it or anything else. No local traditions about its loss there, but he mentioned it, in this survey, and just described it as a ship buried in the sand. So it was a mystery for many, many years, and still an unsolved mystery. We thought that it might be the Forester. There was some evidence of a vessel by that name in the area, but it never proved to be accurate. It may be the Forester, but we cannot establish that. And so it was really exciting to see this mystery ship and to be involved with the excavation over the years, and it's still there.
Yeah, they covered it back up. And for those of you who are interested, there's an excellent book
Yes.
done by Henry Barkhausen and Ted
Yep.
McCutcheon called The Mystery of the Nobbin Sands.
Yes, that's
You can
it.
still get it if you want to find it. It's fairly kind of hard to come by, but still out there. And if any you want to take a crack at trying to solve the mystery, there's a lot of artifacts. There was a chest full of tea with tea stamps that they were able to trace back to England. There was china,
That's right.
number of different things that were found on this ship. And modern day, a maritime archaeologist or historian could really, maybe write a dissertation on this potentially.
Well, a really interesting story is that a few years after I had visited this site and began investigating it, I was living in Superior, Wisconsin, and my next door neighbor had moved from Alaska, and we got to be friends. And at Christmas time, he invited me to visit his home because he had a friend who had come from Alaska, and he wanted me to meet him. Well, his friend's name was Michael Korp, and he had come from Nobbin, Michigan, and was aware of this story and was a descendant of David Korp, who was the crewman who had survived and married the local woman. Anyway, it was really fascinating to discover that link, but it didn't, lead to any further information. Apparently, among the Native Americans and and the Corp family, there was no knowledge of this vessel's name at all. So we're still searching.
Yeah, I mean, she probably dates from around 1839, 1840, the wreck, the state survey.
It appears to be, yeah. I think there was a study done in 1842 of shipwrecks around Lake Michigan, and this doesn't seem to appear in that.
Right.
We couldn't find any evidence. And then, of course, the surveyor found it in, I think, 47. But yeah, still a mystery, and Henry wasn't able to resolve it either.
So I know one of the things that you were real involved in was when the Smithsonian came up and
Yeah,
took the engine from the Indiana off Whitefish Point. That is now at the Smithsonian in Washington.
exactly. You're
Tell us about your
absolutely right.
involvement with that.
Well, it was built in 1848, and a good example of the early propeller-driven package freighters on the Great Lakes. And it's a period in time that always really fascinated me. And when it was discovered, and some divers were able to film it, I developed this drawing. And not long afterwards, it was recovered. As you said, the engine was recovered with the derrick barge from the Corps of Engineers fleet and taken to Smithsonian. But I think it was found in 91, and the engine was removed in 93. And it's not far from Whitefish Point in the east end of Lake Superior, but a really fascinating wreck. And I was a little surprised that the state permitted the removal of the engine, but it is preserved and displayed, for the public at Smithsonian, and not so bad a decision, I guess. But it really revealed a great deal of technical information about the construction of vessels in that period in time. Another thing, by the way, in this same period in time, I was able to acquire some records from a ship chandlery in Cleveland. I mentioned to you that while I was working at the museum in Duluth, some of our board members were officers of the U.S. Steel fleet there. And because they acquired a lot of their ship chandlery from this outfit in Cleveland, they disposed of a lot of historical records because of the U.S. Steel acting in our behalf at the museum. They sent all these records to us in Duluth, and they were incredible. They referred to daily providing of tools and materials for ship construction from 1871 until about World War I.
Wow.
They're an amazing source of information, the Upson Walton Company records. And I spent a number of years transcribing and copying those records before I finally sent them to Cleveland, because they don't belong in Duluth, Minnesota, after all. They should be preserved in Cleveland at Bowling Green University. So anyway, it was a real experience, and I still use those records to this day. And they provide a great deal of detailed information about the materials and the supplies that were provided by ship chandlers for the construction of wooden ships. Extremely detailed records.
I know I just got a stereopticon view. I got several of them from Cleveland, and they show the Upson Walton building with the big Upson Walton ship chandlery in the background.
Yeah.
And of course, those are at Bowling Green, amazing records. But Pat,
Yes.
you eventually retired in 2000, and you were supposed to go on to a long and quiet retirement in Duluth. What happened?
Well, I've been, as you said, I've been retired for a lot of years now. But yeah, I left the museum job in 2000, and actually, I started a small business doing exhibit design and construction for various museums. And so I did exhibits for Bayfield, Wisconsin Museum, and then Two Harbors, Minnesota, all on maritime history. And then, interestingly, I was offered a contract with a museum in New Harmony, Indiana, on the Wabash River. And that proved to be very informative because I knew nothing about river history. And I learned about the construction of boats, I shouldn't call them ships, from the 1820s and 30s on up. And they had a great deal to do with, shipbuilding on the Great Lakes as well. I wouldn't have guessed that, but they had records of one particular artist or explorer from France who came in 1820s to the Wabash River and made very detailed pictures of a lot of the boats being built on the river, and passenger boats and scows and all sorts of, commercial craft. But that proved to be very informative to me. And so that time in my life was a very rewarding one too, the next 3 or 4 years before I came to Alpena in 2003.
So what happened? What made you come to Alpena?
Well, interestingly, after retiring from my job at the museum in Duluth, we had a place out in the woods that we just loved, but we missed family, and most of my family were still in the Detroit area. And so we made the decision to move back to Michigan. And around the same time that we had, been weighing that decision, I was invited to visit the new marine sanctuary then being established in Alpena. And I had known Jeff Gray for a few years, who became the superintendent. He was in Madison, Wisconsin, and was involved in some history there. And he and I worked on a couple of jobs, like at Shipwrecks. Anyway, he invited me to come to Alpena. And so we had an interesting meeting, and he encouraged me to consider moving there. And so I made that decision, and the sanctuary had been approved, but was just then being organized. In the photographs that you see here, the building was acquired from a local business and converted for the sanctuary's visitor center. And in the lower view, you see Governor Granholm there with Jeff Gray, the superintendent. Anyway, before the building was completed or anything, the sanctuary invited a group of divers to investigate one of the local shipwrecks, the schooner Cornelia Windiate. And before the sanctuary had any of its own staff or divers, Joyce Hayward from Ohio found several diver volunteers, and they came up, and I was invited to be a part of that. And we went out and dove the Cornelia Windiate wreck, which had been believed to sink in Lake Michigan in 1875, but it was found on Lake Huron, and it had apparently been coated with ice in a storm and sank very slowly. So there was virtually no damage to the ship whatsoever. And it lies very carefully preserved now in about 180 feet of water off of Alpena. So this was our first organized archaeological dive, and this is my drawing of the wreck site. And later we had a team come in and develop an exhibit in the visitor center, replicating the stern of the wreck of the Cornelia Windiate. And so it's a major display now within the visitor center. But that was our first archaeological investigation, our first dive on one of the local wrecks. And what a thrill it was. Joyce Hayward died not long after that. but she left an incredible record behind and really accomplished a lot for us.
She sure did. I remember the AGLMH meeting where the award for historic preservation was named
Yes.
after her. That was the year I won the award for historic interpretation, and it was kind of bittersweet because we knew that she was ill at the time. But what a
Yeah.
tremendous person she was.
Yes, she was indeed.
So, Pat, one of your greatest legacies, I think, will be your collection, which is in Alpena, and the database that we all go to online for vessel photos of 19th century vessels
Mhm.
is arguably the most complete database of its kind for Great Lakes vessels in the world, and it represents sort of a lifetime of gathering photos, not just by you, but by many of your colleagues who shared photos with you over the years. And of course, we try to continue to keep that database updated. I know I've submitted some things. Tell us a
Yes,
little
you
bit
have.
about that. This is an amazing picture, Pat. This is the your collection.
Well, it's interesting, when you serve for a lifetime in museums, you're not exactly encouraged to build personal collections. And I didn't take these pictures. I developed them, I gathered them from a number of contributors, Father Dowling, Father Vanderlinden, uh, and dozens of other people, around the region. And I ended up with files on about 14,000 pre-1900 watercraft on the Great Lakes. And so when I moved here, I wanted to put them someplace where they would be preserved and shared with a much larger public. I still work in the collection. I can still, contribute, and I can certainly take advantage of all the resources that are there. But I don't want it to be called the Labadie collection, because it isn't. It's formed by so many other wonderful people and shared with me. So it's been a real rewarding career and a real privilege to not only to gather this stuff, but to see it made available to a larger public. And I still have records and research work at home, which have yet to bring down to the collection headquarters. But they're available to the public at the public library, owned by the Marine Sanctuary, and we call it the Thunder Bay Research Collection. And several other people have contributed to the collection since I did in 2008. Uh, and the value of that is that my collection was exclusively 19th century watercraft, and 20th century is more popular, frankly, with collectors and hobbyists and historians. So we've had several collectors, Ken Throw from Duluth, Minnesota, who has passed away, uh, Leonard Barr from St. Mary's River, Marysville, Michigan. They've contributed literally thousands of 20th century, data and imagery. And that's what's made the collection so useful and so valuable for other people. And I'm just delighted with what's come of it. And Walter Lewis from Canada has worked with the library for the last several years to build the database and improve it. And oh gosh, it's just so exciting to see this have come together.
It really is, and it's a tremendous contribution, Pat. And like you say, you laid the groundwork for it, but we definitely are going to continue building on this, and continue to fill in blanks and correct things where we can. So, I know, Pat, you've done some work with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society in recent years. I've got the book that you
Oh
helped put
yeah,
together. It's a really amazing publication.
they did a nice job. Yeah, I was invited to work with them on some of the archaeology investigations they were doing on the numerous wrecks off of Whitefish. And since then, I've been serving on the board of directors there. And I was very pleased with the book that they published. And this is the John Osborne, one of several notable wrecks there. Beautifully preserved and, very well cared for and looked after by the museum. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure to go on working with some of these people. I haven't worked with the National Park Service divers in years, but now with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society group, and it never ends.
No, I imagine not. I know you've had quite a long career and seen a lot of shipwrecks, Pat. Why don't you talk about some of your favorites?
Oh boy, it's hard to pick a favorite, but there are some that really do stand out. My obsession has always been with 19th century, but particularly the 1840s and 50s, and all of the major changes that came to shipbuilding technology during that time, before the introduction of iron and steel. So the examination of shipwrecks all around the lakes has been very informative, very revealing. And not only, have we been able to develop good archaeological drawings of these wrecks, but the Upson Walton records have told us a great deal about the materials that were used for their building and their outfitting. And now we have, incredible technology to film these wrecks and preserve the imagery before they disappear or collapse. So a few of the most interesting wrecks, one of them in particular was a little iron tugboat at Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And it was sunk in the 1880s off of the Sheboygan Harbor. And in recent years, the local city government has tried to remove the wreck, and it was believed to have been a tank for a gas station. They thought it was a steel storage tank for a gas station in the water. In fact, it's the hull of the first iron ship on the Great Lakes. It was built in 1842 on the East Coast for the Corps of Engineers, the topographical engineers. And it was commanded by George Washington's daughter's husband, Colonel Abert. And it was named for him originally in 1842, a sidewheel survey boat brought into the Great Lakes and later renamed the Surveyor by the topographical engineers. And it served from 1843 until 1876. And then the Corps of Engineers decided to sell it and to, get a more modern vehicle or vessel. And so it was acquired by a lumberman in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who renamed it the Julia. And he used it for a number of years for towing log rafts around the Sheboygan area on Lake Michigan, and finally abandoned it and sunk it out off the harbor. And so, interestingly, when I first saw pieces of it, they were being brought ashore to be taken to a local dump. And, they really thought it was part of an old fuel tank for a gas station. So I got pieces of the hull from the oldest iron hull in the Great Lakes. And of course, the topographical engineers later became the Army Corps of Engineers, for whom I ran the museum in Duluth. So we were able to get these few bits and pieces of that incredible vessel. And then I don't remember exactly how I made the acquaintance, but I began corresponding with somebody in Washington, Corps of Engineers, and they put me in touch with a woman who managed a museum in the home of George Washington's daughter, who was the wife of the captain of the Colonel Abert. And the person in charge of the collection there, shared a lot of information with me about Abert's career and his family ties to Washington and everything. So it was very revealing to be able to uncover a lot of this information about that vessel and its place in history.
Definitely.
So that's a favorite. Another one was the Princeton, very early iron or wooden propeller, and then the Indiana, which gave up its engine to Smithsonian a few years ago. So there's some really significant vessels that I've been able to study and to document. And boy, it's been so educational, but also very emotional. And speaking of emotion, when you invited me to address my career, I had to go through a lot of boxes and records in my attic. And boy, it brought back to life some of these incredible discoveries and all the people who have helped me over the years, including Mr. Baylett. Boy, what a gift.
That you've certainly done quite a lot yourself. And I have to say, though, the Colonel Abert, the surveyor, I regularly come across, because I collect the old early harbor survey charts.
Oh yeah, sure.
1830s, 1840s, 1850s. Many of them were done by Colonel Abert himself.
Yeah.
And
there are two. I found two photographs of it. One is a side wheeler lying in the port of Detroit a year or two before it was sold by the Corps of Engineers, and it's not a very good photo. It's a stern view, in a dock, but at least it shows us a bit about the design of the vessel. The second image I found is a view of Sheboygan Harbor, where way across the river in the distance is this white side wheel tugboat, and there's no question it's the Julia, but I can't help wondering if maybe around Sheboygan some family has preserved some other images,
well, I happen to have a couple of images you may not be aware of them, from the 1930s of them raising some parts of the Julia.
Golly.
Yes, I'll share them with you offline. You may have them. They've been published. I've got an old history of Sheboygan book that was published. But anyway, Pat, we're up to about 63 minutes, and we've got where they're asking for more, a second edition of interview with you. some of the people posting. We'll talk about that. I'll see if I can get Pat back, but we had to move heaven and earth to get this to do this. So, Pat, what a privilege! Thank you so much for
what a gift
on the show, and for going through and walking us through the many contributions and highlights over the course of your long career, and just all the things that you've kind of left those of us who are younger with. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I started doing this, when I needed to research a ship, I had to go down and dig through all my papers. Now I can just go on the internet and look at your database. It's
okay.
So it really, thank you so much for everything you've done, Pat. And
bless you.
We will be having a Zoom room with Pat, so hopefully we can get him online. I'm going to send a link out. I'll post the link on Facebook, but I'm also going to email the link, and it should be pretty simple. Just click on it and you can get right in. So Pat, stick around after we shut down. For those of you watch for the Zoom room link. I will post it, and you can hopefully have a little bit of time with Pat. So go and use the restroom, get a beer, and we'll see you all in about 15 minutes in the Zoom room. Good night, everybody, and thanks again, Pat.
Brendan, one other thing, if I may.
Go ahead.
I didn't mention to you my wife's contribution to all of this. She is a very accomplished artist. I happen to be sitting in front of one of her paintings here, of a scow schooner, and she's done dozens of paintings in art for various museums, and gosh, what a gift that is.
It is, and June's work is really substantial. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I really enjoyed her work over the years. So thank you everybody who tuned in. Thank you, Pat. Have a good evening, everybody.